He is just a poor single father, nothing more than a man trying to survive. Those were the exact words that echoed across the polished conference room of Harrington Global Foundation in downtown Chicago, where glass walls, marble floors, and silent observers created an atmosphere of controlled judgment. Inside, executives and board members were gathered for a structured review of community funding allocations, a process designed to evaluate individuals and organizations requesting financial support for social initiatives. At the center of the meeting stood Olivia Carter, a confident chief executive officer known for her strict analytical approach and her belief that value must always be proven through visible results and measurable outcomes. As she reviewed the list of applicants displayed on a large digital screen, her attention briefly stopped on one name: Ethan Walker, a single father with minimal reported income and no formal institutional backing. His application summary was brief, lacking corporate affiliations, financial statements of significance, or recognizable endorsements, which in Olivia's assessment placed him in the lowest tier of consideration. Around the table, subtle reactions from other executives suggested mild curiosity, but Olivia's expression remained firm and dismissive as she noted that limited resources should be allocated to candidates with higher measurable impact potential. In her professional view, poverty was often associated with inefficiency, and efficiency defined success. What she did not yet recognize was that the system she trusted relied heavily on incomplete visibility, where the most impactful contributions were often those not recorded in formal reports. Meanwhile, far from the corporate environment, Ethan Walker was living a quiet and disciplined life in a modest suburban home, where each day revolved around raising his child and maintaining stability through consistent effort rather than recognition. He worked without attention or acknowledgement, moving through responsibilities with steady focus, never drawing public notice and never seeking validation from external systems that measured worth in financial terms. Alone, back at the foundation meeting, Olivia finalized the preliminary review notes, categorizing Ethan Walker's application under low priority review, assuming that limited funding exposure would be a more efficient allocation strategy. The decision was made without emotional consideration, strictly based on data visibility and institutional criteria. Yet as the meeting progressed, a brief mention from a supporting analyst hinted at previous anonymous donations linked to the same name, though the information was incomplete and unverified within the current system records. Olivia paused for a moment, her attention narrowing slightly, but she quickly dismissed the detail as insufficient for immediate reevaluation. The meeting concluded with standard approvals and rejections being processed, and Ethan Walker's file remained unchanged in status. However, beneath the structured efficiency of the system, an unseen history was beginning to surface, one that had not yet been fully connected to the man quietly living outside the reach of institutional recognition, setting the stage for a truth that would challenge every assumption made in that room. In the days following the initial review meeting at Harrington Global Foundation, the internal evaluation process continued quietly across multiple departments, with Ethan Walker's application remaining in a low-priority category within the structured funding system. Olivia Carter resumed her executive responsibilities with focus, moving between strategy sessions, performance reviews, and allocation planning meetings, where decisions were continuously driven by measurable outcomes and institutional efficiency metrics. Yet despite the procedural closure of Ethan Walker's file, a subtle inconsistency had begun to emerge within the Foundation's extended data network, as fragmented records associated with his name appeared across separate archival systems that were not immediately linked within the primary evaluation dashboard. These references were minimal, lacking formal categorization, but they contained repeated indicators of financial movement that did not align with his recorded income level. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his daily life with quiet consistency, maintaining his household responsibilities and caring for his child while operating outside any structured recognition system. His routines remained simple and disciplined, centered around stability rather than visibility, and he moved through each day without awareness of how his name was being interpreted within corporate environments. Back at the Foundation, a junior data analyst flagged one of the irregular entries during a routine audit of historical contribution records, noting that an anonymous donation series matched timing patterns connected to Ethan Walker's identification profile. The finding was not yet verified, but it was sufficient to generate a secondary review request within the system. Olivia Carter was informed during a brief executive update session, where the anomaly was presented as a low-confidence data irregularity requiring further validation. She reviewed the summary with a calm but analytical expression, noting that while the correlation was interesting, it lacked definitive confirmation and therefore did not warrant immediate reclassification of Ethan Walker's application status. However, the existence of multiple fragmented entries across different reporting layers introduced a level of uncertainty that did not fully align with her initial assessment. Later that evening, Olivia accessed the expanded background file independently, reviewing archived donation logs, nonprofit distribution records, and anonymized funding channels that showed irregular but significant financial activity associated with the same identity marker. The data suggested a pattern of consistent contribution behavior spanning several years, though the absence of direct attribution kept the information outside standard evaluation thresholds. Meanwhile, Ethan remained in his quiet environment, continuing his life without interruption, unaware that his name was gradually shifting from a dismissed application entry into a subject of internal institutional inquiry. As Olivia closed the file after extended review, she paused briefly, acknowledging internally that the profile she had initially categorized might not reflect the full reality, marking the first subtle fracture in her original judgment. Following the emerging irregularities identified within Harrington Global Foundation's extended archival network, the internal review process regarding Ethan Walker transitioned into a more detailed secondary analysis phase, where fragmented financial records and anonymized contribution data were systematically re-examined across multiple disconnected databases. Olivia Carter, while maintaining her executive responsibilities, allocated additional attention to the anomaly report during a scheduled oversight session, where analysts presented newly correlated entries suggesting that Ethan Walker's identity marker appeared across multiple independent philanthropic distribution channels over an extended period of time. These entries were not originally linked within the primary evaluation framework due to their anonymized classification structure, which separated donor identity from transaction visibility in accordance with privacy protocols governing high-value charitable distributions. However, when cross-referenced through updated system mapping tools, a pattern began to form indicating consistent financial movement associated with large-scale contributions that extended far beyond the expected capacity of a single father with limited reported income. Despite this emerging data, Olivia maintained procedural caution, emphasizing that correlation did not yet constitute verification and that all findings required formal authentication before any modification of Ethan Walker's application status could be considered. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his life in quiet consistency, moving through his daily responsibilities without awareness of the institutional reassessment taking place around his identity. His routines remained unchanged, grounded in practical stability and family care, reflecting no outward indication of the financial activity being attributed to his profile within external systems. Back at the foundation, a senior data integrity specialist conducted a deeper audit of the anonymized donation pathways, revealing that several of the contributions linked to Ethan Walker's identifier had been routed through intermediary foundations and community support structures designed specifically to conceal donor identity while maximizing regional impact efficiency. This discovery significantly elevated the credibility of the emerging pattern, suggesting that the financial activity was not accidental, but rather part of a deliberate long-term philanthropic strategy. Olivia reviewed the updated findings during a closed executive briefing, where the tone of discussion shifted subtly from curiosity to analytical concern, as the scale of potential contributions associated with Ethan Walker exceeded the initial assumptions made during the first evaluation. Still, she refrained from drawing conclusions, instructing her team to continue validation through verified financial tracing and independent confirmation protocols. Later that evening, Olivia revisited the compiled records alone, reviewing cross-referenced donation histories, organizational impact reports, and regional funding outcomes tied to the anonymized transactions. The data suggested sustained involvement in multiple community initiatives, all of which had produced measurable improvements in housing, education, and emergency support systems, yet none of which had ever been publicly attributed to Ethan Walker. Meanwhile, Ethan remained absent from this growing institutional narrative, continuing his life without awareness that his identity was gradually being reconstructed through fragmented financial evidence. As Olivia closed the reports, her expression reflected a subtle shift in perspective, acknowledging that the initial classification of Ethan Walker as insignificant may have been based on incomplete visibility rather than factual absence, marking the beginning of a deeper reassessment that had not yet fully reached its conclusion. Following the continued internal validation of fragmented financial records linked to Ethan Walker, the Harrington Global Foundation entered a more intensive verification phase, where cross-institutional data, matching, and long-range philanthropic tracing were applied to confirm the legitimacy of previously anonymized contributions. Olivia Carter reviewed the updated analytical summary in a restricted executive session, where senior auditors presented a significantly expanded pattern of financial activity associated with Ethan Walker's identity marker across multiple independent charitable distribution networks. The revised dataset now indicated that the contributions were not isolated incidents, but part of a sustained and structured giving pattern extending over several years, with documented impacts across community, housing initiatives, educational support programs, and emergency relief funding channels. This level of activity directly contradicted the original assumption that Ethan Walker was financially insignificant, introducing a measurable gap between perceived status and actual recorded impact. Despite the clarity of the emerging evidence, Olivia maintained a disciplined analytical stance, emphasizing the necessity of full verification through legally recognized financial attribution before any formal reassessment could be finalized. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his daily life without deviation from his established routine, remaining unaware that his identity was now the subject of deep institutional analysis and that his past actions were being reconstructed through fragmented financial systems. His environment remained unchanged, defined by quiet responsibility and consistent care for his child, with no external indicators suggesting the scale of his previously hidden financial contributions. At the foundation, the audit team conducted a deeper review of intermediary transaction pathways, revealing that many of the contributions linked to Ethan Walker had been routed through layered nonprofit structures specifically designed to ensure anonymity while maximizing regional distribution efficiency. This finding strengthened the credibility of the pattern significantly, suggesting intentional long-term philanthropic strategy rather than coincidental financial activity. Olivia examined these findings during a private review session, where the tone of interpretation shifted further toward cautious reassessment, as the accumulated data now demonstrated a level of sustained impact that exceeded initial institutional expectations by a substantial margin. However, she remained grounded in procedural discipline, instructing her team to continue tracing verification pathways and eliminate any possibility of identity misattribution before drawing final conclusions. Later that evening, Olivia accessed the full reconstructed profile once again, reviewing consolidated reports that now included verified impact metrics tied to Ethan Walker's anonymized contributions, showing measurable improvements in multiple community development sectors directly influenced by the funding channels in question. As she studied the data, the distinction between perceived insignificance and actual impact became increasingly difficult to reconcile within her original framework of evaluation. Meanwhile, Ethan remained entirely removed from this evolving institutional understanding of his actions, continuing his life with steady simplicity and without recognition of the scale of influence being attributed to him. As Olivia closed the system interface, her expression reflected a quiet but undeniable shift in perception, acknowledging that the Foundation's initial classification of Ethan Walker may have represented a structural failure of visibility rather than an accurate reflection of value, setting the stage for a forthcoming revelation that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the entire assessment. As the verification process at Harrington Global Foundation progressed into its most critical analytical phase, the internal system transitioned from pattern recognition to full-scale attribution reconstruction regarding the financial activity linked to Ethan Walker. Olivia Carter, now deeply engaged in reviewing consolidated audit reports, observed that the compiled data had reached a level of consistency that no longer suggested anomaly, but instead indicated a sustained and deliberate philanthropic structure operating across multiple independent channels. The updated analysis presented during the executive oversight briefing confirmed that Ethan Walker's identity marker was repeatedly associated with high-volume anonymous donations distributed through intermediary nonprofit organizations designed to maximize social impact while preserving donor confidentiality. These contributions, when aggregated across verified channels, represented a cumulative financial scale measured in the millions, directly contradicting the initial classification of Ethan Walker as a low-value applicant within the Foundation's funding review system. Despite the clarity of the emerging financial pattern, Olivia maintained procedural discipline, requiring final validation through formal cross-institutional confirmation before any structural reevaluation could be enacted. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his life in complete separation from the institutional analysis unfolding around his identity, maintaining his routine of work, caregiving, and household responsibility without awareness that his past actions were being reconstructed across multiple financial and social impact databases. His environment remained unchanged, defined by simplicity and consistency, with no external indication of the scale of influence being attributed to him. At the Foundation, the Audit Division expanded its verification scope to include cross-jurisdictional financial tracing, revealing that several of the donation streams linked to Ethan Walker had contributed to long-term improvements in community infrastructure projects, educational funding initiatives, and emergency response support systems across multiple regions. The findings demonstrated not only financial magnitude but also sustained temporal consistency, indicating that the contributions were neither accidental nor isolated, but part of a long-term pattern of structured giving. Olivia reviewed these findings in a closed executive analysis session, where the interpretation of Ethan Walker's profile began to shift from initial dismissal toward structured reassessment, as the data increasingly contradicted the assumptions that had defined the original evaluation. However, she remained anchored in institutional procedure, instructing the audit team to continue identity verification through direct financial pathway confirmation and eliminate any remaining possibility of misattributed transactional linkage before final classification adjustments could be considered. Later, while reviewing the fully consolidated report independently, Olivia examined the complete reconstructed profile that now integrated verified impact metrics, anonymized transaction histories, and cross-referenced nonprofit distribution records, all of which pointed toward a consistent pattern of large-scale philanthropic activity originating from Ethan Walker's identity marker. As the scale of documented contributions became increasingly undeniable, the gap between perceived insignificance and verified impact widened beyond her initial evaluative framework, forcing a silent reconsideration of the assumptions that had guided the Foundation's early judgment. Meanwhile, Ethan remained entirely outside this institutional revelation, continuing his life with steady normalcy and without awareness that his name was now associated with millions in anonymous contributions. As Olivia closed the final report interface, she paused in silence, recognizing that the classification of Ethan Walker was no longer a matter of insufficient data, but a fundamental misinterpretation of value visibility, marking a decisive turning point in the Foundation's understanding of the man they had once dismissed. As the internal investigation at Harrington Global Foundation reached its most critical stage, the accumulated financial reconstruction of Ethan Walker's identity had now transitioned from fragmented anomaly detection into a fully structured philanthropic attribution profile, supported by multi-layer verification across independent institutional databases. Olivia Carter, reviewing the final consolidated audit report in a restricted executive review session, observed that the evidence had reached a level of consistency that could no longer be classified as coincidental or unverified, as every cross-reference data stream aligned with a sustained pattern of high-value anonymous donations distributed over multiple years through interconnected nonprofit networks. The analysis confirmed that Ethan Walker's contributions were not isolated events, but part of a deliberate and continuous financial strategy designed to channel significant resources into community development initiatives while maintaining complete anonymity. The total verified impact now extended into the millions, directly contradicting the original assumption that had placed him in the lowest tier of funding consideration. Despite the undeniable weight of the findings, Olivia maintained procedural control, ensuring that all final attribution steps required formal institutional validation before any official reassessment or public classification change could occur. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his life in complete separation from the institutional systems, analyzing his past actions, maintaining his daily routine with steady discipline and quiet responsibility, entirely unaware that his identity had become the subject of high-level financial reconstruction across multiple verified data networks. His environment remained unchanged, defined by simplicity and stability, with no external indication of the scale or reach of the contributions being attributed to him. At the foundation, senior audit specialists completed the final stage of cross-jurisdictional verification, confirming that the donation pathways associated with Ethan Walker were consistently routed through legitimate intermediary organizations specifically structured to preserve donor anonymity while maximizing long-term social impact across housing, education, and emergency assistance programs. These findings eliminated remaining uncertainty regarding attribution accuracy and established a clear, traceable pattern of intentional large-scale philanthropy. Olivia reviewed the final confirmation report in silence, recognizing that the Foundation's initial classification had been based on incomplete visibility rather than factual absence of value, and that the system had fundamentally misinterpreted the subject due to structural limitations in anonymized financial tracking. The realization introduced a significant shift in her internal evaluation framework, as the contrast between perceived insignificance and verified global impact became impossible to reconcile within the original assessment model. Meanwhile, Ethan remained outside this institutional transformation of his identity, continuing his life without recognition or awareness of the scale of influence now definitively associated with his name. As Olivia closed the final report interface, she remained still for a moment, acknowledging that the case of Ethan Walker had evolved beyond a simple funding review into a systemic revelation about how value can exist entirely independent of visibility, marking the point at which the Foundation's understanding of success, worth, and recognition began to fundamentally change. As Harrington Global Foundation entered the final stage of its internal reassessment regarding Ethan Walker, the institutional understanding of his identity had now shifted from uncertainty to verified confirmation, with all major audit divisions aligning on a consolidated conclusion supported by fully traced philanthropic financial pathways. Olivia Carter reviewed the final executive synthesis report in a restricted decision chamber, where the complete reconstruction of Ethan Walker's financial activity was presented across layered analytical frameworks, showing a sustained and deliberate pattern of high-value anonymous donations distributed through multiple verified nonprofit infrastructures over an extended timeline. The report confirmed that these contributions, when fully aggregated, amounted to millions in total impact, directly funding community housing development, educational support initiatives, and emergency assistance programs across multiple regions. This final validation eliminated all remaining classification ambiguity, establishing Ethan Walker not as a low-value applicant as originally assessed, but as a major concealed philanthropic contributor whose influence had remained invisible due to intentional anonymity structures embedded within the donation system. Despite the clarity of the findings, Olivia maintained procedural discipline, ensuring that all institutional protocols for identity reclassification and external acknowledgement remained strictly controlled and required formal board-level authorization before any public or structural changes could be implemented. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his life without disruption or awareness of the institutional transformation occurring around his identity, maintaining his daily responsibilities with consistent discipline and quiet focus, entirely separated from the financial systems, now definitively attributing millions in impact to his past actions. His environment remained unchanged, defined by simplicity, stability, and personal responsibility, with no external indication of the magnitude of his previously hidden contributions. At the foundation, senior executive auditors completed the final confirmation sequence, verifying that all transaction pathways associated with Ethan Walker were legitimate, traceable, and intentionally structured through intermediary philanthropic organizations designed to maximize social impact, while preserving donor anonymity at the highest level. This confirmation solidified the conclusion that the financial activity was not only authentic but sustained, intentional, and strategically distributed over time, eliminating any remaining possibility of misclassification or data error. Olivia studied the final report in silence, recognizing that the Foundation's original evaluation had been fundamentally shaped by incomplete visibility rather than factual absence of value, and that Ethan Walker's perceived insignificance had been a direct result of systemic limitations in how anonymous philanthropy is recorded and interpreted. The realization created a profound internal shift in her understanding of value assessment, as the contrast between external appearance and verified impact reached a point of irreversible clarity. Yet, even as the institutional system finalized its conclusion, Ethan Walker remained entirely outside this transformation, continuing his life without awareness that his identity had been redefined within one of the most powerful philanthropic databases in the organization. As Olivia closed the final file and the system returned to silence, she acknowledged that the case had permanently altered the Foundation's perception of worth, proving that the most significant impact often exists completely independent of recognition, visibility, or acknowledgement, marking the end of one evaluation and the beginning of a deeper reconsideration of how value itself should be defined. As Harrington Global Foundation finalized its internal validation process regarding Ethan Walker's philanthropic identity, the institution transitioned into a formal resolution phase where all departments aligned their findings into a unified executive classification report confirming his status as a major concealed donor with sustained multi-year impact across multiple social infrastructure sectors. Olivia Carter reviewed the finalized dossier in a restricted executive chamber, where the complete reconstruction of Ethan Walker's financial footprint was presented in structured analytical layers, showing verified anonymous contributions distributed through intermediary nonprofit networks designed to preserve donor confidentiality while maximizing long-term community benefit. The report confirmed without ambiguity that Ethan Walker's contributions collectively reached millions in value, directly funding housing assistance programs, educational support initiatives, and emergency relief operations across multiple regional jurisdictions, establishing a consistent pattern of intentional philanthropic engagement that extended far beyond initial institutional assumptions. Despite the finality of the data, Olivia maintained procedural discipline, ensuring that all formal recognition protocols, identity confirmation standards, and external classification adjustments remained under strict governance review, pending executive board authorization. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his life entirely outside the scope of institutional recognition, maintaining his daily responsibilities with steady discipline and quiet focus, unaware that his identity had been fully reconstructed within one of the most advanced philanthropic tracking systems in operation. His environment remained unchanged, defined by simplicity, personal responsibility, and stability, with no external indication of the scale of financial impact attributed to his past actions. At the Foundation, senior auditors completed the final cross-verification sequence, confirming that all donation pathways linked to Ethan Walker were legitimate, structurally consistent, and intentionally designed through layered nonprofit frameworks to ensure maximum social distribution efficiency while maintaining complete anonymity of origin. This final validation eliminated any remaining interpretive uncertainty, confirming that the financial activity represented a deliberate and sustained philanthropic strategy rather than incidental or misattributed data. Olivia studied the completed report in silence, recognizing that the institution's original evaluation had been fundamentally constrained by structural limitations in visibility, where anonymized contributions had prevented accurate assessment of true value and influence. The realization prompted a significant internal reassessment of the Foundation's evaluation methodology, as the gap between perceived insignificance and verified impact had now been fully resolved through comprehensive data integration. Yet, even as the institutional system reached its final conclusion, Ethan remained entirely outside this transformation, continuing his life without awareness that his identity had been redefined within the organization's highest-level philanthropic records. As Olivia closed the final executive file, she remained still for a moment, acknowledging that the case of Ethan Walker had permanently reshaped the Foundation's understanding of value, proving that true impact can exist entirely independent of recognition, visibility, or acknowledgement, marking the conclusion of the investigation and the beginning of a deeper institutional reflection on how worth should be measured in a system built on incomplete perception. As Harrington Global Foundation entered the final closure phase of its internal investigation regarding Ethan Walker's philanthropic identity, the institution transitioned from analytical validation into formal resolution documentation, where all verified findings were consolidated into a final executive report confirming the complete and sustained impact of his anonymous financial contributions across multiple social infrastructure systems. Olivia Carter reviewed the finalized dossier in a restricted board-level session, where the comprehensive reconstruction of Ethan Walker's philanthropic activity was presented in fully verified structure, showing consistent multi-year distribution of high-value donations routed through intermediary nonprofit organizations designed to preserve anonymity while ensuring maximum community impact across housing support, education development, and emergency assistance programs. The final report confirmed without ambiguity that Ethan Walker's total verified contributions reached millions in cumulative value, establishing him as a significant concealed benefactor whose influence had remained entirely outside institutional recognition due to deliberate anonymity protocols embedded within philanthropic financial systems. Despite the absolute clarity of the findings, Olivia maintained procedural discipline, ensuring that all classification updates and formal acknowledgement procedures remain subject to final executive authorization before any structural or public reclassification could be enacted. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his life entirely disconnected from the institutional transformation of his identity, maintaining his daily routine with quiet consistency, focused on raising his child and managing personal responsibilities without awareness that his name had been fully reconstructed within one of the most advanced philanthropic tracking frameworks in operation. His environment remained unchanged, defined by simplicity, stability, and absence of external recognition, with no visible indication of the extensive financial impact now attributed to his past actions. At the Foundation, senior audit officials completed the final identity confirmation sequence, verifying that all transaction pathways associated with Ethan Walker were legitimate, structurally consistent, and intentionally designed through layered nonprofit networks to ensure both anonymity and sustained social impact efficiency over extended time periods. This final validation eliminated all remaining analytical uncertainty, confirming that the philanthropic activity was neither incidental nor misattributed, but the result of a deliberate and continuous long-term giving strategy. Olivia reviewed the completed report in silence, recognizing that the Foundation's initial classification had been fundamentally shaped by systemic limitations in visibility, where anonymized contributions had prevented accurate assessment of true value and societal influence. The realization solidified a profound institutional shift in perspective, as the gap between perceived insignificance and verified impact was fully resolved through comprehensive data integration and cross-system validation. Yet, even as the organization reached its final conclusion, Ethan remained entirely outside this transformation, continuing his life without awareness that his identity had been permanently redefined within the Foundation's highest-level philanthropic records. As Olivia closed the final file and the system returned to operational silence, she acknowledged that the case of Ethan Walker had permanently altered the institution's understanding of value, demonstrating that the most significant impact can exist entirely independent of recognition, visibility, or acknowledgement, marking both the conclusion of the investigation and the beginning of a deeper reconsideration of how worth should be measured in a system built upon incomplete perception.